Some names echo through history not because we want to remember them, but because we cannot afford to forget them. This is a true story. Before we descend into one of the darkest chapters in human history, I need to ask something of you. We're a small channel trying to reach 100 subscribers, 100 people who believe that the most difficult stories are often the most important to tell. If you're willing to walk this path with me tonight, click that subscribe button. We're hoping for 50 likes on this episode. I know that sounds like a small ask given what we're about to discuss, but your support tells me these stories matter. And please, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I want to know how far these files travel. How many corners of the earth still care about justice, even when it arrives too late? Now let me tell you about a man who turned medicine into monstrosity. His name was Josef Mengele, and for 34 years after the war ended, he lived free. Every town keeps a secret. Some just bury it deeper than others, but some secrets refuse to stay buried. They surface in survivors' nightmares, in documents hidden in attics, in bones exhumed from graves marked with false names. This is the story of how science became cruelty, how a physician became an executioner, and how the world's most wanted man vanished into thin air, only to die peacefully in his sleep decades later, having never faced a single day in court. I'm Julian Cross, and tonight's file is not an easy one. In fact, I need to be honest with you from the start. What I'm about to share involves events so disturbing that I'll be omitting certain explicit details to comply with content guidelines. But make no mistake, even what I can tell you will be difficult to hear. The truth, even softened, remains almost unbearable, yet it must be told, because forgetting is not an option, silence is not an option, and pretending these things didn't happen is the greatest insult we could offer to those who suffered. So settle in, turn down the lights, and let me tell you about the Angel of Death. The year was 1911. In the Bavarian town of Günzburg, a child was born into comfortable circumstances. His father owned a factory, his mother kept a proper home. The boy, Josef, was bright, exceptionally so. He excelled in school, showed promise in the sciences, and seemed destined for respectability. Nothing about his early life suggested the horror to come. And perhaps that's the most terrifying thing about this story. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives with credentials, with pressed uniforms, with doctorates from prestigious universities. Mengele pursued academia with vigor. By 1935, he had earned a doctorate in anthropology from the University of Munich. His dissertation examined jaw structures across different ethnic groups, seeking to identify what he called racial distinctions. Even then, the seeds were being planted. Science, in his hands and in the hands of those who taught him, was becoming a tool not of discovery, but of justification. Justification for ideology, for supremacy, for what would eventually become genocide. But he didn't stop there. Mengele completed a second doctorate, this time in medicine, studying under Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer at the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt. That name, racial hygiene, should send a chill down your spine, because that's what they called it. They gave it official titles, institutional backing, academic legitimacy. The university didn't shut it down. Colleagues didn't protest. The system accepted it, nurtured it, funded it. Verschuer saw potential in his student. He saw ambition, intelligence, and most dangerously, ideological alignment. When the opportunity arose, Verschuer would orchestrate Mengele's assignment to a place where human subjects were unlimited, where ethical oversight was non-existent, where a doctor could do whatever he wanted without consequence. That place was Auschwitz. The trains arrived day and night, packed cattle cars filled with human beings, men, women, children, families torn from their homes across occupied Europe. The doors would slide open, and the prisoners would stumble out onto the platform, disoriented, terrified, clinging to whatever possessions they'd managed to carry. They had no idea what awaited them. How could they? The machinery of systematic extermination was unprecedented in human history. Standing on that platform, amid the chaos and fear, was a figure whose survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. Tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed in an SS uniform, often with a baton or stick in one hand. He would whistle classical music, Wagner, Schubert, while deciding who would live and who would die. A gesture to the left, a gesture to the right. It seemed casual, almost choreographed. But those gestures were death sentences. Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943. He was 32 years old, a qualified physician with 2 doctorates, and he saw the camp not as a site of atrocity, but as an opportunity. Here was an endless supply of human subjects for research, no ethics committees to answer to, no consent forms required, no consequences for failure. Prisoners were, in the Nazi calculus, not humans but material to be used and discarded. If you're feeling uncomfortable right now, good. You should be, because what I'm about to describe is what happens when medicine abandons its oath to do no harm, when science serves ideology instead of truth, when qualified professionals decide that some lives matter less than others. And before we go further, let me pause to say this. If these stories stay with you, if they haunt you the way they haunt me, subscribe to this channel, because the next file might be darker still, and someone needs to remember, someone needs to bear witness. Mengele had an obsession. Twins. In his mind, twins represented the perfect research subjects. Identical twins share the same genetic material, which meant, theoretically, that any differences between them could be attributed to environmental factors rather than heredity. It was scientifically logical. It was also morally abhorrent, because the research he had in mind required no regard for the subject's humanity, safety, or survival. Survivors later estimated that approximately 3,000 twins passed through Mengele's selection process during his time at Auschwitz. When the cattle car doors opened and families spilled onto the platform, SS guards would shout, "Zwillinge heraus! Twins, step forward!" Parents, desperate to keep their children alive, would comply, not knowing they were handing them over to something worse than the gas chambers. At least the gas chambers offered a swift end. Mengele's laboratory offered prolonged suffering. Let me introduce you to Eva Moses Kor. She was 10 years old when she arrived at Auschwitz with her twin sister Miriam and their family. Eva remembered the moment vividly, even 70 years later. She recalled being pulled from her mother's arms, her mother screaming, reaching out as the guards dragged Eva and Miriam away. That was the last time Eva saw her mother, her father, her 2 older sisters. All of them were sent directly to the gas chambers. But Eva and Miriam were twins, so they were spared immediate death for something far more insidious. Eva described Mengele's demeanor as chillingly pleasant. He would approach the children like a kindly uncle, she said, sometimes bringing chocolates or sweets. He spoke softly, reassuringly. "Don't be afraid," he would tell them in German. "Nothing is going to happen to you." And then he would inject them with substances they couldn't identify, or extract blood until they lost consciousness, or subject them to procedures that left them scarred for life. Due to content restrictions, I cannot describe the full extent of what these children endured. But I can tell you this: the experiments had no legitimate medical purpose. They were not designed to heal or to advance genuine understanding. They were exercises in cruelty disguised as science, justified by an ideology that deemed these children less than human. Imagine being 10 years old, torn from your family, surrounded by guards and dogs and barbed wire, knowing that everyone you loved was likely dead, and then having to face a man in a white coat who smiled while he hurt you. Week after week, month after month, not knowing if today would be the day you didn't wake up. Of the approximately 3,000 twins who entered Mengele's research program, only about 160 survived the war. Think about that ratio. 95% of them perished, either from the experiments themselves, from infections and complications, or from deliberate termination when they were no longer useful. A Jewish pathologist named Miklos Nisli worked under Mengele's supervision. He was forced to perform autopsies on the victims, including children. Nisli later testified that on one occasion, Mengele terminated 14 pairs of twins in a single night. The method was systematic: first sedation, then a lethal injection directly into the heart. The purpose: so that Nisli could perform comparative autopsies on twins who had perished at exactly the same moment, allowing Mengele to examine whether their internal organs showed identical or different pathologies. After the autopsies, the organs deemed interesting were preserved in formaldehyde, carefully labeled and shipped to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin for further study. Because this wasn't the work of a lone madman, this was institutionalized horror. Universities and research institutes across Germany were complicit, accepting shipments of specimens, analyzing data, publishing findings, all derived from suffering they chose not to question. And here's something that should make your blood run cold. Mengele's mentor, Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, the man who orchestrated his assignment to Auschwitz, continued his academic career after the war. He taught at the University of Münster until 1965, 20 years after the war ended. He retired with honors. He was never prosecuted. The institution that employed him never apologized. If you're feeling angry right now, channel that anger. Share this video. Let people know these stories still matter. Because this didn't happen in some distant, primitive past. This happened within living memory. Some survivors are still alive today, still carrying these scars, still trying to make sense of a world that let this happen. But Mengele's obsessions extended beyond twins. He had another fixation: eye color. In Nazi ideology, blue eyes were considered a marker of racial purity, a trait of the so-called Aryan race. Brown eyes, common among Jews and Roma, were seen as inferior. Mengele wanted to understand whether eye color could be manipulated, whether brown eyes could be turned blue through chemical intervention. If such a thing were possible, it could theoretically be used to improve the genetic stock of the population. Working in collaboration with a researcher named Karin Magnusson at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, Mengele conducted a series of procedures on children's eyes. He injected chemicals, including adrenaline, directly into their eyes, attempting to alter pigmentation. The children, understandably, were terrified. The injections caused excruciating pain, inflammation, and in many cases permanent damage. When the chemical approach failed to produce the desired results, Mengele resorted to a more direct method. He simply removed the eyes entirely and sent them to Berlin for microscopic examination. I'm not going to describe this process in detail. I can't. But understand that we're talking about conscious children having their eyes surgically extracted, often without adequate anesthesia, so that a scientist could examine the cellular structure of the iris under a microscope. There was a family in the camp, a Roma family, with an unusually high incidence of heterochromia, a condition where a person's two eyes are different colors. Mengele found this fascinating from a genetic perspective. He documented them extensively, took endless measurements and photographs, and when he'd gathered sufficient data, he had them terminated so he could study their eyes post-mortem. Again, I need to emphasize, this wasn't medicine. This wasn't research in any legitimate sense. This was sadism dressed in a lab coat, cruelty with footnotes. Mengele also conducted experiments on individuals with dwarfism, on giants, on anyone whose physical characteristics deviated from what he considered the norm. He exposed prisoners to diseases, injected them with bacteria and viruses, performed surgeries without anesthesia, subjected children to unnecessary X-rays and radiation. The list of horrors is extensive, and I'm sparing you the worst of it. But here's what I want you to understand. Throughout all of this, Mengele maintained the outward appearance of a professional. He kept meticulous records. He documented everything: measurements, procedures, outcomes. He corresponded with colleagues in Berlin, discussing his findings as though they were routine scientific observations. He attended social functions at the camp, played music, socialized with other SS officers. By all accounts, he was polite, cultured, well-mannered. That's the banality of evil. It doesn't always look like a raving lunatic. Sometimes it looks like a man in a pressed uniform, whistling Mozart while deciding who lives and who dies. Eva Moses Kor, who I mentioned earlier, survived against all odds. After the war, she immigrated to the United States, married, had children, and eventually founded the Candles Holocaust Museum in Indiana to educate people about the Holocaust and promote forgiveness. Yes, forgiveness. Eva publicly forgave the Nazis, including Mengele, saying that forgiveness freed her from the burden of hatred. But even Eva, with all her strength and grace, carried the physical scars for the rest of her life. Her sister Miriam, who survived Auschwitz alongside her, died in 1993 from kidney failure, a direct result of the experiments Mengele conducted on her when she was 10 years old. The damage he inflicted lasted decades. Eva passed away in 2019 at the age of 85, still giving testimony, still educating, still fighting to ensure the world would never forget. If her story moves you, take a moment right now and click the like button. We're trying to reach 50 likes on this video. It's a small gesture, but it tells me these stories still resonate, that people still care about truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Now let's talk about what happened when the war began to turn against Germany. By late 1944, it was clear the Third Reich was collapsing. The Allies were advancing from the west, the Soviets from the east. The Nazi leadership began destroying evidence, dismantling camps, scattering to the winds. And Josef Mengele, ever the survivor, began planning his escape. On January 17, 1945, as Soviet forces approached Auschwitz, Mengele fled. He took his records with him, boxes of documentation, photographs, research notes. To him, these were valuable scientific data. To history, they were evidence of crimes against humanity. He made his way west, avoiding capture in the chaos of the collapsing German state. Unlike many high-ranking Nazis who were captured in the immediate aftermath of the war, Mengele slipped through the net. He was briefly held by American forces, but because he wasn't wearing his SS uniform and didn't carry identification revealing his true role, he was released. Can you imagine? The most wanted man in the world standing in front of Allied soldiers, and they let him go because they didn't know who he was. This is where the story becomes less about one man's crimes and more about the systematic failure of justice. Because what happened next, Mengele's escape, his decades in hiding, his peaceful death without ever facing trial, that's not just his story. That's the story of how the world failed. After the war, a network of escape routes emerged, known as the Ratlines. These were organized paths that allowed Nazi war criminals to flee Europe, primarily to South America. The routes typically ran through Spain or Italy, with assistance from sympathetic clergy, corrupt officials, and established German expatriate communities in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. The system was disturbingly efficient. A fleeing Nazi could obtain false identity papers through the International Red Cross, an organization that has since faced significant criticism for its role in these escapes. With a fake passport and some cash for bribes, a war criminal could board a ship in Genoa or another Mediterranean port and disappear into the vastness of South America. An estimated 9,000 to 10,000 Nazi war criminals escaped through these routes, 5,000 to Argentina alone, 2,000 to Brazil, 1,000 to Chile. These weren't just low-level functionaries, these were architects of genocide, camp commanders, doctors who conducted medical atrocities. And the world, exhausted by war and increasingly focused on the emerging Cold War, let it happen. Mengele obtained a Red Cross passport under the false name Helmut Gregor. On June 22, 1949, he boarded a ship bound for Argentina. He was 38 years old, in good health, carrying with him the secrets of thousands of victims. And for the next 30 years he would live in relative comfort, never facing prosecution, never offering testimony, never expressing a single word of remorse. If that makes you angry, and it should, then share this video. Let people know that justice delayed is justice denied, that the failure to prosecute these crimes in the immediate aftermath of the war sent a message, that some atrocities are so large they become immune to punishment. Argentina in the late 1940s and 1950s was, in many ways, a haven for former Nazis. President Juan Perón's government maintained permissive policies toward European refugees, asking few questions about their pasts. Buenos Aires had a substantial German expatriate community, German-language newspapers, German social clubs. A man could disappear into that community and live quite openly without fear of discovery. And that's exactly what Mengele did. By 1956, he was living under his real name, Josef Mengele, in the affluent Buenos Aires suburb of Olivos. He practiced medicine without a license, performing procedures for members of the German community. At one point, he apparently performed an unlawful medical procedure that resulted in a patient's death. He was briefly jailed, but a friend posted bail and he was released. No extradition, no prosecution, no consequences. Think about that. The angel of death was practicing medicine in Argentina, living under his real name, and nobody stopped him. Part of the reason for this was that West Germany wasn't actively searching for him until the late 1950s. The German government, in the immediate post-war years, was more concerned with rebuilding than with prosecuting war criminals. Many former Nazis found positions in the new German government, the judiciary, the police force. There was an institutional reluctance to dig too deeply into the past, because doing so would implicate too many people who were now considered respectable citizens. Mengele married his brother's widow, a woman named Martha, and they lived together in Buenos Aires. He worked on a farm under the alias Francisco Fischer, bought shares in an agricultural business called Fadro Farm, and maintained correspondence with his family back in Günzburg. His family, who owned a successful farm equipment manufacturing company, quietly sent him money. They never publicly acknowledged his whereabouts, but they never cut him off either. For 10 years, from 1949 to 1959, Josef Mengele lived in Argentina largely unmolested. He attended German social events, went to the cinema, dined in restaurants. He lived a normal life, something his victims never got to do. But then, in 1960, everything changed. On May 11, 1960, a team of Mossad agents, Israel's intelligence service, captured Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, in a suburb of Buenos Aires. Eichmann had been living under a false name, working in a factory, trying to blend in. The Mossad agents grabbed him off the street, sedated him, disguised him as a crew member, and smuggled him onto an El Al flight to Israel. The operation sent shockwaves through the community of Nazi fugitives in South America. If Eichmann could be captured, if Israeli agents were operating in Argentina, then nobody was safe. Mengele, who had been living relatively openly, realized he needed to move. In May 1959, actually just before Eichmann's capture, suggesting he had advance warning, Mengele fled to Paraguay. Paraguay had no extradition treaty with West Germany or Israel, and its government was notoriously corrupt and sympathetic to former Nazis. Mengele settled on a farm in Hohenau, near the Argentine border, and obtained Paraguayan citizenship under his real name. Two prominent members of the local German community falsely swore that he had lived in the country for 5 years, meeting the residency requirement for citizenship. So now Josef Mengele, the most wanted war criminal in the world, had legal citizenship in a South American country that refused to extradite him. He should have been untouchable. But the Eichmann capture changed the calculus. Eichmann was taken to Israel, put on trial in 1961, and executed in 1962. The trial was broadcast internationally. Survivors testified, the world watched, and suddenly the hunt for other Nazi war criminals intensified. West Germany, facing international pressure and a new generation of prosecutors determined to pursue justice, issued an arrest warrant for Mengele. Israel's Mossad made him a high-priority target. Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal dedicated enormous resources to tracking him down. Mengele, sensing the walls closing in, made one final move. In October 1960, some sources say 1961, he crossed the border into Brazil and disappeared. Brazil in the 1960s and 1970s was vast, chaotic, and difficult to police. The military dictatorship that ruled the country had bigger priorities than extraditing aging German immigrants. Mengele obtained yet another false identity, this time as Peter Hochbichler, with assistance from Hans-Ulrich Rudel, a decorated Luftwaffe pilot and unrepentant Nazi sympathizer. In Brazil, Mengele lived under a succession of aliases, moving from house to house, town to town, always staying a few steps ahead of investigators. He befriended Wolfgang Gerhard, a former Nazi Party member and Austrian emigrant, who sympathized with his plight. He later stayed with a Hungarian couple, the Bossets, who provided him shelter and protection, despite knowing who he was. During these years, Mengele lived modestly but comfortably. He had financial support from his family in Germany. He maintained a low profile, avoided German social events, and stayed away from major cities. According to those who knew him, he became increasingly paranoid and melancholy as the years passed. He kept newspapers and magazines, obsessively tracking the search for himself, reading about the ongoing efforts to bring him to justice. The hunt for Mengele became one of the most extensive manhunts in history. Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, pursued leads across South America for decades. Mossad agents followed tips and rumors. West German prosecutors issued international warrants. There were reported sightings in Paraguay, Chile, Bolivia, even as far as Egypt and Southeast Asia. But every lead went cold. Every tip turned out to be false or outdated. The Mengele family in Günzburg, meanwhile, maintained silence. They were interviewed repeatedly by investigators, but claimed they had no contact with him, no knowledge of his whereabouts. This was a lie. Documents discovered later proved they had been sending him money and corresponded with him through intermediaries, but they never broke. Years passed. The 1960s became the 1970s. Mengele aged. His health began to fail. He suffered from anxiety, insomnia, perhaps guilt, though he never expressed any publicly, and the world kept searching for a man who was effectively a ghost. If you're still with me at this point in the story, take a moment and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this file travels, what corners of the world are still willing to engage with difficult history, because these stories matter everywhere, not just in the places where they happened. February 7th, 1979. Bertioga, Brazil. Their coastal resort town about 70 kilometers east of São Paulo. Josef Mengele, now 67 years old, grey-haired and frail, was visiting the beach with the Bosserts, the Hungarian couple who had been sheltering him. He went into the water for a swim. According to the Bosserts' account, he suffered a stroke while in the water and drowned. The angel of death died in the sea, his body pulled from the waves by strangers who had no idea who he was. No trial, no confrontation with survivors, no reckoning with his crimes, just a medical episode, and then silence. The Bosserts buried him secretly in the Embu cemetery under the name Wolfgang Gerhard, using the real Gerhard's family plot. For 6 years the secret held. The world continued searching for a man who was already dead, lying in an unmarked grave with someone else's name on the marker. In 1985, German police, acting on evidence seized from a Mengele family friend, finally located the grave. They exhumed the remains. Forensic experts from Brazil, West Germany, and the United States examined the skeleton. Dental records suggested it was Mengele. Skull measurements, bone structure, healed fractures that matched his medical history, all pointed to the same conclusion. But in 1985, DNA testing was not yet sophisticated enough to provide absolute certainty. There were doubters. Some survivors refused to believe he was dead, convinced he was still out there somewhere, that this was just another deception. It wasn't until 1992 that the question was finally settled. British forensic experts conducted DNA analysis, comparing bone samples from the exhumed remains with DNA from Mengele's surviving son and his former wife. The results were conclusive. The probability that the remains were anyone other than Josef Mengele was less than 1 in 1800. On April 8, 1992, the German and Israeli governments officially acknowledged Josef Mengele's death. The hunt was over. He had been dead for 13 years by that point, and free for 34 years before that. Let me repeat that because it's important. Josef Mengele, the man responsible for some of the most calculated cruelty in human history, lived free for 34 years after the war ended. He died of natural causes, peacefully, without ever facing a courtroom, without ever being forced to answer for what he did, without ever having to look survivors in the eye and hear their testimony. Is that justice? Now we need to ask ourselves, how did this happen? How did the most wanted war criminal in the world evade capture for 3.5 decades? The answer is complicated and uncomfortable because it implicates not just Mengele, but entire systems, governments, institutions, and societies that chose not to prioritize justice. First, the Ratlines. These weren't spontaneous escape routes. They were organized networks that required infrastructure, funding, and institutional support. The Catholic Church, through certain priests and bishops, provided assistance to fleeing Nazis under the guise of humanitarian aid for displaced persons. The International Red Cross issued travel documents with minimal verification. Officials in Spain, Italy, and South American countries accepted bribes and looked the other way. Second, the Cold War. By the late 1940s, the United States and Soviet Union were locked in ideological conflict, and both sides prioritized recruiting Nazi scientists, intelligence officers, and military strategists over prosecuting war criminals. The CIA's Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to America. The Soviets did the same on their side. The message was clear. If you had useful knowledge or skills, your crimes could be overlooked. There's no definitive evidence that Mengele specifically benefited from American protection, but the broader context suggests that intelligence agencies were more interested in fighting communism than in comprehensive war crimes prosecution. Third, West Germany's reluctance. The German government in the 1950s was staffed by many former Nazis. The judiciary, the police, the civil service all contained people who had been complicit in the Third Reich and had no interest in reopening those wounds. It wasn't until a new generation of prosecutors came of age in the 1960s that Germany began seriously pursuing Nazi war criminals. By then, many had already escaped or died. Fourth, the sheer scale of the crimes made prosecution difficult. There were hundreds of thousands of perpetrators. The resources required to hunt them all down, gather evidence, conduct trials, it was overwhelming. Countries prioritized the highest profile cases, but even then, many escaped through bureaucratic cracks. And fifth, there was simply a failure of will. The world was tired, the war was over, people wanted to move on, rebuild, focus on the future rather than the past. That's understandable on a human level, but it's also a betrayal of the victims who deserved to see their tormentors face justice. Simon Wiesenthal, the legendary Nazi hunter, spent decades pursuing Mengele. He followed leads to Paraguay, Brazil, and beyond. He pressured governments, worked with Mossad, coordinated with journalists. But he lacked the resources and official support to mount an effective search in the vastness of South America. When Mengele's death was finally confirmed in 1992, Wiesenthal was 83 years old. He had dedicated his life to this pursuit, and in the end, his quarry had slipped away. If you've made it this far, if you've stayed with me through this long and difficult story, then you understand why these files matter. Click subscribe. We're trying to build a community of people who believe that the hardest stories are the ones we most need to hear. Because forgetting is not an option. But there's another dimension to this story that's equally disturbing: the complicity of the scientific establishment. Mengele was not a rogue actor. He was not some isolated lunatic conducting experiments in secret. He was part of a system, an institutional framework that supported, funded, and legitimized his work. His mentor, Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, specifically arranged for Mengele to be assigned to Auschwitz to conduct research. Verschuer knew what was happening there. He received shipments of specimens, blood samples, organs, tissue samples from Auschwitz. He corresponded with Mengele about findings. He co-authored papers based on this research, and after the war, he continued his academic career without interruption. He taught at the University of Münster until 1965. He retired with full honors. He was never prosecuted. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics, and Eugenics, one of Germany's most prestigious research institutions, collaborated extensively with Mengele's work. Scientists there analyzed the specimens he sent, incorporated his data into their own research, and published findings in academic journals. These were not fringe researchers. These were respected scientists at the peak of their careers. After the war, the Kaiser Wilhelm Society was reorganized as the Max Planck Society, and it continued operating without a meaningful reckoning with its Nazi past until the 1990s. It took 50 years for the institution to conduct a comprehensive historical investigation into its role in Nazi atrocities. The conclusion, published in the early 2000s, acknowledged that many scientists and administrators at the Kaiser Wilhelm Society were deeply implicated in the Nazi system, and that ethical lines were clearly crossed. That's putting it mildly. The point is this: Mengele's crimes were possible because an entire system enabled them. He had institutional support, academic legitimacy, peer collaboration, and funding. The universities didn't object. The medical establishment didn't protest. The scientists didn't refuse the data he generated. They all participated willingly in the perversion of medicine and science into tools of genocide. And after the war, most of them got away with it. They kept their jobs, their reputations, their pensions. They trained the next generation of scientists without ever acknowledging what they had done. That's the legacy. Not just one man's cruelty, but a system's complicity. A reminder that evil doesn't require monsters. Sometimes it just requires people who follow orders, who prioritize career advancement over ethics, who convince themselves that their work is legitimate because it's sanctioned by institutions. So where does that leave us? As I sit here in the darkness, surrounded by files and photographs and testimony, I keep coming back to the same question. What does justice look like when the guilty party dies free? Eva Moses Kaur, who I mentioned earlier, chose forgiveness. She said that forgiving Mengele freed her from the burden of hatred, allowed her to move forward, to live a full life rather than being consumed by bitterness. That's extraordinarily courageous. It's also entirely personal. Not all survivors felt the same way. Some wanted vengeance, some wanted acknowledgement, some just wanted the world to remember. What they all deserved was a trial. They deserved to see Mengele in a courtroom, forced to confront what he had done, compelled to answer questions, to hear victim testimony, to be held accountable. They deserved a verdict, a sentence, a public acknowledgement that his actions were crimes against humanity, and they were denied that. Mengele's death in 1979 meant that justice, in the legal sense, was forever out of reach. The case was closed, not because it was resolved, but because the perpetrator was beyond the reach of earthly courts. But there's another kind of justice, the justice of memory. Every time someone tells this story, every time someone educates others about what happened, every time someone refuses to forget, that's a form of justice. Not complete, not satisfying, but something. The survivors who dedicated their lives to testimony, people like Eva Moses Kaur, like Miklos Nisli, like the dozens of others who spoke publicly despite the trauma, they ensured that Mengele's crimes would not be forgotten. They turned their suffering into education, their survival into purpose. Eva founded the Candles Holocaust Museum. She gave thousands of lectures. She met with students, answered questions, shared her story over and over even when it was painful. When she died in 2019, she was in Poland, visiting Auschwitz with a group of students, still teaching, still fighting, forgetting. That's a kind of justice. And you watching this video right now, learning about this history, refusing to look away, that's justice too. Because the only thing worse than Mengele dying free would be his crimes being forgotten, his victims becoming nameless statistics, the lessons of this era fading into obscurity. There's one more thing I want to share with you before we close this file. In 2009, Brazilian authorities exhumed Mengele's remains a second time. They wanted to extract more bone samples for additional DNA testing, using newer technology that could provide even greater certainty. But there was another reason. They wanted to retrieve the bones for preservation and eventual display in a museum or research context, not to glorify him, but to serve as a teaching tool, a tangible reminder of his existence and crimes. But here's what they found. The grave had been vandalized. Some of the bones were missing, apparently taken by souvenir hunters or neo-Nazi sympathizers. The skull was intact, along with most of the skeleton, but pieces were gone. Even in death, Mengele became a symbol, contested, fought over, argued about. Some people wanted to destroy his remains, to obliterate every trace of him. Others wanted to preserve them as evidence and warning, and still others wanted to glorify him, which is perhaps the most disturbing response of all. The bones that remained were eventually stored at the São Paulo Institute for Forensic Medicine, kept under tight security. They remain there today, a grim relic of history, evidence of a man who existed and died, proof that he was real and not some nightmare we imagined. Let me tell you about the Mengele family in Günzburg. Because their story is part of this too. The Mengele family owned a successful farm equipment manufacturing company, Carl Mengele & Sons, which is still in operation today under different ownership. After the war, the family continued living in Günzburg, maintaining their business, their social standing, their respectability. They knew where Josef was. They sent him money. They corresponded with him through intermediaries. And they never told the authorities. For decades, the family maintained silence. When investigators came asking questions, they claimed ignorance. When journalists pressed them, they declined to comment. The company distanced itself from Josef, removing his name from official documents, but privately they supported him financially until his death. This created an impossible situation for the people of Günzburg. The Mengele company was the town's largest employer. Many families depended on it for their livelihoods. How do you condemn a family that's supporting your community? How do you demand they turn in their relative when doing so might jeopardize your own security? It's a moral compromise that haunted Günzburg for generations. The town became known as Mengele's town, associated with his crimes despite having no direct involvement. Young people growing up there had to grapple with their community's connection to one of history's most notorious criminals. Some left, unwilling to bear that association. Others stayed, trying to work through the complicated legacy. In recent years, the town has made efforts to confront this history more honestly. A documentary was made about Günzburg's relationship with the Mengele name. Local historians have worked to educate residents, particularly young people, about what Josef Mengele did and the town's complicated role in his story. It's painful work but necessary because here's the thing. Complicity doesn't always look like active participation. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like choosing economic stability over moral clarity. Sometimes it looks like ordinary people making understandable but ultimately indefensible choices. The Mengele family members who supported Josef after the war weren't in the camps. They didn't conduct experiments, but they helped a war criminal evade justice. They chose family loyalty over accountability, and in doing so they extended his freedom by decades. Is that a crime? Legally, in many jurisdictions, yes. Harboring a fugitive, obstruction of justice. Morally? That's for you to decide. Now, I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough in stories like this: the psychological aftermath for survivors. Eva Moses Kaur, despite her remarkable resilience and capacity for forgiveness, carried physical and psychological scars for her entire life. She had nightmares. She experienced survivor's guilt, the agonizing question of why she lived when so many others perished. She struggled with the memory of watching other children die, knowing she was powerless to help them. Her sister Miriam, who survived alongside her, suffered even more severe physical consequences. The experiments Mengele conducted on her caused kidney damage that plagued her for decades. She eventually required dialysis. She died at age 54 from kidney failure, a direct result of what was done to her when she was 10 years old. Eva always said that Mengele didn't just take Miriam's childhood, he took her life, just on a longer timeline. Other survivors experienced similar long-term effects. Some had chronic pain from injuries inflicted during experiments. Others had organ damage, impaired immune systems, or neurological problems. And all of them carried the psychological weight of their experiences. Trauma that could manifest in anxiety, depression, difficulty forming relationships, inability to trust authority figures. Many survivors found it difficult to speak about their experiences for years or even decades after the war. The trauma was too raw, the memories too painful. Some worried they wouldn't be believed, that people would think they were exaggerating or fabricating stories too horrific to be true. Others simply wanted to move on, to build new lives without being defined by their victimhood. It wasn't until the Eichmann trial in 1961 that many survivors began speaking publicly. The trial, which was broadcast internationally, created a space for survivor testimony. It sent a message that these stories mattered, that the world was finally ready to listen. In the decades since, thousands of survivors have given testimony, participated in documentaries, written memoirs, and spoken at schools and universities. But every time they tell their story, they relive the trauma. Every interview, every testimony, every lecture, It requires them to mentally return to the camps, to remember things they've spent years trying to forget. And they do it anyway, because they believe memory is a form of resistance. They believe that bearing witness is their responsibility to those who didn't survive. If you appreciate the courage that requires, if you understand the sacrifice these survivors made to ensure we wouldn't forget, then hit that like button. We're still trying to reach 50 likes on this video. It's a small gesture, but it means something. It says these stories still matter. That truth still matters. Let me tell you about the broader implications of Mengele's escape, because this story isn't just about one man. The fact that Mengele lived free for 34 years sent a message to other war criminals. If you can evade capture long enough, you might get away with it. And many did. Of the tens of thousands of Nazi perpetrators, only a small fraction were ever prosecuted. Most lived out their lives in comfortable obscurity, never facing consequences. This created a culture of impunity that extended beyond World War II. In the decades since, the world has witnessed other genocides: Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and others, and in each case, many perpetrators escaped justice. The lesson of Mengele's escape was that international justice is difficult, that political will is often lacking, so that time and distance can provide immunity from prosecution. It wasn't until the establishment of the International Criminal Court in 2002 that the world had a permanent institution dedicated to prosecuting crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. But even now, the court faces significant challenges: limited jurisdiction, lack of enforcement mechanisms, and resistance from powerful nations. Mengele's story is a cautionary tale about what happens when justice is delayed or denied. It's a reminder that the longer we wait to hold perpetrators accountable, the less likely it becomes that they'll ever face consequences. But there's another lesson here too: the importance of documentation. The reason we know so much about Mengele's crimes is because survivors testified, because records were preserved, because historians and journalists and prosecutors refused to let these events fade into obscurity. Without that work, Mengele might have become a footnote, his crimes reduced to a line in a history book. Every survivor who gave testimony, every historian who spent years in archives, every journalist who investigated these stories, they ensured that Mengele's name would be forever associated with his crimes. They denied him the anonymity he sought in death. They made sure the world would remember not just what he did, but who he was: a human being who made choices, who had agency, who could have acted differently but didn't. That's not justice in the legal sense, but it's something. It's the refusal to forget. It's the insistence that perpetrators be named, their crimes documented, their victims remembered. And in a world where so many atrocities go unacknowledged, that matters. I want to address something that often comes up when discussing the Holocaust: the question of why people didn't resist more, why prisoners didn't fight back, why bystanders didn't intervene. This question usually comes from a place of genuine confusion, but it betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of totalitarian systems and the reality of the camps. Auschwitz was designed to be inescapable. It was surrounded by electrified fences, guard towers, armed SS personnel, and trained dogs. Prisoners were starved, worked to exhaustion, and subjected to constant surveillance. They had no weapons, no allies on the outside, no resources. The penalty for any resistance was immediate execution, not just of the individual, but often of their entire block or family. There were resistance efforts. Prisoners did organize, did sabotage, did attempt escapes, usually unsuccessfully. The Sonderkommando uprising in October 1944, where prisoners working in the gas chambers revolted and managed to destroy one of the crematoria, is the most famous example. Almost all the participants were subsequently caught and executed, but they fought anyway. Mengele's victims were in an even more impossible position. Most were children, twins selected from the regular camp population and kept in a separate barracks. They were isolated, traumatized, and utterly dependent on their captors for survival. What resistance could a 10-year-old mount against an armed SS officer in a death camp? And as for bystanders, the German population, the neighboring communities, the international community, The question of why they didn't intervene more forcefully is complicated. Some didn't know the full extent of what was happening. Others knew but felt powerless to act. Many were afraid for their own safety or the safety of their families, and some, tragically, simply didn't care or actively supported the regime's actions. This isn't to excuse inaction. It's to acknowledge that resistance in the face of overwhelming power is extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The people who did resist, the individuals who hid Jewish families, who smuggled information out of the camps, who refused orders at great personal risk, they're heroes precisely because what they did was so rare and dangerous. But the burden of resistance shouldn't fall primarily on victims and bystanders. The burden of responsibility falls on the perpetrators and the systems that enabled them. Mengele made choices. Verschuer made choices. The scientists at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute made choices. The officials who issued false passports after the war made choices, and they should be held accountable for those choices. Here's something that doesn't get discussed enough. Mengele kept a journal. During his years in hiding in South America, he wrote extensively, personal reflections, philosophical musings, observations about the world. These journals were discovered after his death, and portions have been published and analyzed by historians. What's striking about them is what's missing. Any expression of remorse, any acknowledgement of wrongdoing, any empathy for his victims. Instead, Mengele presents himself as a misunderstood figure, a victim of circumstance, a scientist who was simply doing his job. He expresses frustration about the manhunt against him, resentment toward those pursuing him, and self-pity about his exile and isolation. In one entry, he wrote about feeling lonely and unappreciated, lamenting that his scientific work had been mischaracterized and that history would judge him unfairly. He compared himself to other scientists whose work was controversial, but later vindicated. Reading these journals is profoundly disturbing because they reveal a man utterly lacking in self-awareness or moral comprehension. He genuinely seemed to believe he had done nothing wrong, that his research was legitimate, that he was being persecuted for ideological reasons rather than prosecuted for crimes. This is the mindset of someone who has fully internalized an ideology that dehumanizes others. Mengele didn't see his victims as people. He saw them as subjects, as material, as data points in his research, and because he didn't recognize their humanity, he felt no guilt about their suffering. This is why ideology is so dangerous. It doesn't just justify cruelty. It blinds people to the very fact that they're being cruel. It creates a framework in which atrocity becomes rational, in which torture becomes research, in which genocide becomes policy. And here's the scariest part. Mengele was highly educated. He had 2 doctorates. He was intelligent, cultured, well-read. He wasn't some ignorant brute. He was a product of Germany's finest universities. He studied under respected professors. He published in academic journals. Education, by itself, isn't enough to prevent atrocity. In fact, education can make atrocity more efficient, more systematic, more deadly. What matters is moral education, teaching people to recognize the humanity of others, to question authority, to resist ideologies that dehumanize. If you're a parent, a teacher, someone who works with young people, this is your call to action. Teach empathy, teach critical thinking, teach history. Not just the facts, but the moral lessons. Because the only way to prevent future Mengeles is to raise children who would refuse to become him. And if that resonates with you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because these lessons aren't just about the past, they're about the present and the future. Let me tell you about one more person, Simon Wiesenthal. Wiesenthal was a Holocaust survivor who dedicated his life after the war to hunting Nazi war criminals. He established the Jewish Historical Documentation Center in Austria, which gathered evidence and tracked down perpetrators. He worked with governments, intelligence agencies, and journalists. He pursued hundreds of cases over decades. Mengele was his white whale, the one who got away. Wiesenthal followed leads to Paraguay, Brazil, and beyond. He interviewed informants, analyzed documents, coordinated with Israeli intelligence. At various points, he came tantalizingly close. There were moments when Mengele was within reach, when one more break in the case might have led to capture. But it never happened. Resources were limited. Governments were reluctant to devote significant assets to hunting aging war criminals. The vastness of South America made surveillance nearly impossible, and Mengele, despite his paranoia and melancholy, was careful. He moved frequently, maintained minimal contact with the outside world, and relied on a small circle of trusted protectors. When Mengele's death was finally confirmed in 1992, Wiesenthal was 83 years old. He had spent nearly 50 years pursuing this man, and in the end his quarry had died free, having evaded capture despite the most extensive manhunt in history. In interviews after the confirmation, Wiesenthal expressed disappointment but not defeat. He emphasized that the search itself had value, that it sent a message to other war criminals that they would never be safe, that the pursuit would never end, that the world wouldn't forget. He argued that even though Mengele died without facing trial, the fact that he spent 34 years in hiding, paranoid and isolated, cut off from his family and homeland, living under false names in constant fear of discovery, that was its own form of punishment. Not justice, perhaps, but something. Wiesenthal died in 2005 at age 96, having dedicated his entire adult life to the pursuit of justice for Holocaust victims. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, established in his honor, continues his work today, tracking war criminals, combating anti-Semitism and educating people about the Holocaust. His legacy is a reminder that the pursuit of justice doesn't end with death. It continues through institutions, through education, through memory. Every person who learns about the Holocaust, who visits a memorial, who refuses to let these events be forgotten, they're continuing Wiesenthal's work. And that includes you. Right now, watching this video, you're part of that chain of memory. You're helping ensure these stories survive another generation. So let's return to where we started, the question of how a man like Josef Mengele could exist, could commit such atrocities, and could live free for decades afterward. The answer is systemic. It's not just about one man's pathology or cruelty. It's about institutions that enabled him, ideologies that justified him, systems that protected him, and societies that failed to hold him accountable. Mengele was trained at prestigious universities. He was mentored by respected professors. He received funding from established research institutions. His work was reviewed, published, and incorporated into the academic literature. This wasn't one madman acting alone. This was an institutional apparatus of cruelty, with Mengele as merely its most visible representative. After the war, that system protected its own. Scientists who collaborated with Nazi research continued their careers. Universities declined to investigate their complicity. Governments prioritized political stability over historical accountability. And individual families, like the Mengeles, chose loyalty over justice. The lesson isn't that evil is rare and exceptional. The lesson is that evil is often mundane, institutional, and normalized. It's people following orders, advancing their careers, rationalizing their actions, and declining to question the systems they're part of. The philosopher Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil. The idea that great atrocities are often committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people who fail to think critically about what they're doing, who prioritize obedience over morality, who fragment responsibility so that no individual feels personally accountable. Mengele saw himself as a scientist, not a torturer. The SS guards saw themselves as soldiers following orders. The administrators saw themselves as bureaucrats managing logistics. Everyone played a small role in an enormous machine, and nobody took responsibility for the outcome. That's how genocide happens. Not through one monstrous decision, but through thousands of small ones, each individually rationalized, each seemingly justified within its narrow context, but collectively resulting in horror. The question for us today is, what systems are we part of? What institutions do we support? What small decisions are we making that collectively might contribute to injustice? Are we thinking critically about our roles, our responsibilities, our complicity? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary ones. Because the alternative, assuming that atrocity only happens elsewhere, perpetrated by people fundamentally different from ourselves, is a comforting fiction that leaves us unprepared to recognize and resist evil when it emerges in new forms. Let me bring this back to the individual level, because ultimately this story is about people, real people, with names, families, dreams, and lives that were stolen from them. Eva Moses Kor was 10 years old. Her twin sister was 10 years old. They had parents who loved them, older sisters who protected them, a home, a community. They were children, and they were subjected to procedures that caused them pain, fear, and lasting damage, not for any medical purpose, not to heal or to help, but simply because a doctor decided they were useful research subjects. Think about that. Think about a 10-year-old child alone in a laboratory, surrounded by strangers in white coats being injected with unknown substances, having blood extracted, enduring procedures without explanation or comfort. Think about the fear. Think about the confusion. Think about the loneliness of being separated from your parents, not knowing if they're alive or dead, having only your twin sibling for comfort, and even then being kept in uncertainty about whether you'll both survive. That's the human reality beneath the statistics. Behind every number, the 3,000 twins, the 160 survivors, the 1.3 million prisoners transported to Auschwitz, there's a person with a story, a life, an inner world of thoughts and feelings and hopes that was brutally disregarded. We have to remember them not as victims, though they were victimized, but as people. People with agency, with dignity, with humanity that persisted even in the most inhumane conditions. People who resisted when they could, who supported each other, who maintained their sense of self despite everything designed to strip it away. Eva Moses Kor survived. She immigrated to America, she married, had children, built a life. She chose forgiveness not because what happened to her was forgivable, but because carrying hatred would have given Mengele continued power over her life. She founded a museum, educated thousands of people, and spent her final years ensuring the world wouldn't forget. That's not just survival, that's victory. Not a complete victory. Nothing can undo the trauma, restore what was lost, or bring back those who perished. But it's a rejection of the dehumanization she was subjected to. It's a reclaiming of agency, an assertion that her story belongs to her, that she gets to decide what it means. Other survivors made different choices, and those are equally valid. Some dedicated themselves to pursuing justice through legal channels. Some became historians, ensuring the documentary record was preserved. Some simply tried to live quiet lives, building families and communities, finding peace in the ordinary rhythms of daily existence. There's no right way to be a survivor. There's no obligation to forgive, no requirement to become an educator or activist. The only obligation is ours, those of us who didn't experience these events directly, to listen, to learn, to remember, and to ensure it doesn't happen again. Before I close this file, I want to talk about responsibility, our responsibility here and now. The Holocaust didn't happen in some distant, primitive past. It happened within living memory. There are survivors still alive today, though their numbers dwindle with each passing year. There are perpetrators still alive too, hiding in plain sight, living under assumed names, carrying secrets to their graves. But increasingly, the Holocaust is becoming history rather than current events. The generation that experienced it directly is passing. Soon there will be no survivors left to give testimony, no witnesses left to say, "I was there and this is what happened." That makes our role more important than ever. We become the keepers of memory, the transmitters of these stories to future generations. And that's a sacred responsibility, because how we tell these stories matters. If we sentimentalize them, we drain them of their power. If we turn them into entertainment, we dishonor the victims. If we simplify them into good versus evil narratives, we miss the complicated lessons about complicity, enablement, and the banality of evil. We have to tell these stories with honesty, with complexity, with nuance. We have to acknowledge the failures of justice, the complicity of institutions, the persistence of anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred. We have to connect historical events to contemporary issues, helping people understand that the mechanisms that enabled the Holocaust, dehumanization, scapegoating, authoritarianism, institutional complicity, are still present in our world today. And we have to do this work even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges our assumptions about progress and civilization, even when it forces us to confront difficult truths about human nature and the fragility of moral norms. If you've stayed with me through this entire file, if you've engaged with this difficult history, then I'm asking you to take one more step. Talk about it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Discuss it with your family, your friends, your community. Visit a Holocaust museum if you have access to one. Read survivor memoirs. Support organizations dedicated to Holocaust education and remembrance. Because these stories survive only if we keep telling them. Memory survives only if we refuse to let it fade. Let me bring us to a close. It's past midnight now, as I sit here surrounded by documents and photographs and the weight of history. I've spent hours with this file, with Josef Mengele's story, with the accounts of survivors and the records of investigators. And I keep coming back to the same fundamental question. What do we do with stories like this? We can't undo what happened. We can't bring back the dead, heal the traumatized, or restore what was lost. We can't prosecute a man who's been dead for 45 years. We can't change the fact that he lived free, that justice was denied, that the systems designed to hold perpetrators accountable failed spectacularly. But we can remember. We can bear witness. We can ensure that the victims' names and stories aren't forgotten, that their suffering wasn't meaningless, that their deaths testified against those who caused them. Josef Mengele died in the ocean off the coast of Brazil in 1979. He was 67 years old. He died free, having never faced trial, never been forced to account for his actions, never expressed remorse. His death was peaceful, mundane, utterly disproportionate to the magnitude of his crimes. But his name lives on, not with honor, but with infamy. He's remembered not as the scientist he fancied himself, but as a symbol of medicine perverted, humanity betrayed, and justice denied. Every time someone tells his story, every time someone educates others about what he did, that's a form of judgment, a verdict rendered by history, if not by courts. The angel of death is dead, but the children he experimented on, the few who survived, lived to tell their stories. They testified, they educated, they refused to be forgotten. And in doing so, they denied Mengele the one thing he might have wanted most: anonymity, the luxury of being forgotten, the privilege of escaping history's judgment. Eva Moses Kaur died in 2019 at age 85. Simon Wiesenthal died in 2005 at age 96. Miklos Nisli, the pathologist forced to work under Mengele, published his testimony and died in 1956. One by one, the witnesses are leaving us, but their words remain, preserved in books, recordings, and testimonies. Their voices echo across time, ensuring we remember, and now that responsibility passes to us, to you and to me. We become the witnesses to the witnesses, the keepers of memory, the ones who refuse to forget. So I'll ask you one last time. If this story haunts you, if it challenges you, if it makes you think about justice and memory and responsibility, subscribe to this channel. We're trying to reach 100 people who believe difficult stories matter. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Hit that like button if you think these files are worth preserving. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because every town keeps a secret. Some just bury it deeper than others. But some stories refuse to stay buried. They surface in survivors' testimony, in historians' research, in videos like this one. They demand to be told, to be remembered, to be reckoned with. Josef Mengele escaped earthly justice, but he didn't escape history. And as long as we keep telling his story, as long as we remember his victims, as long as we learn from the failures that allowed him to evade accountability, he never will. This is Julian Cross, closing another file from the Midnight Archive. The case is cold. The perpetrator is dead. But the lesson remains urgent. Justice delayed may be justice denied, but memory preserved is resistance eternal. Until next time, keep the stories alive. Because the dead are counting on us to remember, and the living are counting on us to learn. Good night.